come and learn. Fascinating thing. So with Purim approaching, just a standard chazal that is commonly referenced. Our Shabbat, the Gemara says that Amar Rabbah, the Jews received the Torah at Mount Sinai. They received it. However, they returned and received it again in time of Achashverosh. Rashi writes, "Me'ahavat hanes." That time was done out of love for the nes. They accepted it again. So we learn, and this is one of the commonly referenced themes of Purim, that in Purim there was a moment of return to Kabbalat Torah, to receiving the Torah again, but this time it was mi'ahava, from love. Now certainly your presence here demonstrates a deep connection to Torah that you're taking off at a work day, and when Rabbi Robinson called me, I said, well, I'm not aware of any legal holiday. He says, no, it's not a legal holiday. It's in the middle of the week. You selected a day, and they're taking off from work. I said, it's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, that already shows a level of Ahavat Torah, a sort of connection to Torah. But let's talk a little bit about Ahavat Torah, the love of Torah, or I'm sorry, Ahavas of Torah. I'm sorry, I have to mispronounce it, right? Torah, not Torah. It's just probably.
You're covered. We have Mizrahi.
All right, okay. But putting all that aside. What's the heap of though? All right, so we had a pandemic, or we still have it. It's Machlokes CDC and HaChaim. During the pandemic, during the shutdown, different people did different things. Right? People had time in their hands. Some people took up making sourdough bread. Other people took up gardening. All sorts of people took up different things. What did our great HaChaim do? What did the great Rabbanim do during the time of pandemic? Talk about Purim. One of the Svarim on Megillat Esther was written by the Ramah, Moshe Isserus, the famous posek, the one who paskins for the Ashkenazim. That they're Yotzeim b'yad Ramah, as Chacham Ovadia would always say. So he writes in the beginning of his introduction to his commentary on Megillat Esther, which is called Yarchei. He writes, he says there was a plague. I had to leave Krakow where he lived. And he says the place that I came to was Midbar Shameh. There was barely any food to be had. He says even water was hard to come by. He said Purim came around. He said Sudas Purim, there was nothing to eat. There was no possibility of doing anything similar to a Sudas Purim. So what does he write? Akuma ve'esmecha b'mif'ali. He says, what am I going to do that I can replace my Purim, my Suda? He says, I'm going to get up and take joy in my actions. And that's when he wrote his commentary, Mechir Yain. What did he do during his pandemic? He wrote a sefer. His Ahavas Torah. That's where he channeled his energy. That's where he channeled his strength. He wrote a sefer. And you should know, by the way, I did some research. There are actually articles written on this. You know how many Svarim, important Svarim probably that you even heard of, that were written by Rabbanim while they were out of town in a state of plague or in jail or all of these unusual circumstances. Many Choshev Svarim were written that way. But what is Ahavas Torah? And more importantly, how do we get that Ahavat Torah? So the answer is that Ahavas Torah is like any other love. It's a profound internal force, unknown and unfelt sometimes, unseen. It draws you to Torah, overwhelming everything else. It soothes you. It strengthens you. It preoccupies you. It interferes with your life. You prioritize it over everything else. And it hurts deeply, profoundly, viscerally when you're separated from it. Let's think about this. Let's try to give it terms that we can maybe relate to. Let's imagine for a moment. Just work with me here. I'm going to put on your imagination caps. Imagine we lived in a place where all of a sudden a string of massive snowstorms hit us. I'm not talking about the stuff we get. Talking about honest to goodness snowstorms. Like they got in Northern California, 16 feet. We're not prepared for this. Kids need to get to school. Kids need to get to school. And all of a sudden, these soldiers is a problem. What would happen? So, maybe, I'm just speculating, a bunch of guys would be sitting around the Kiddush table on Shabbos after davening. Of course, they have the prerequisite 90-year-old scotch there, and they're sitting there talking with their herring, or probably more likely a nice bowl of cholent. They're saying, what are you going to do about the stone? Kids got to get to school. They say, you know what, let's make a committee. Let's make a committee, and we'll meet and we'll discuss it. Sure enough, they make a committee, they meet, of course they have you have your primo sushi, you got your elegant pastries, they sit, they talk about it. We got to make a campaign. We got to raise money for this. We've got to get this done. Okay, so you can imagine. They select whichever of the different companies that do these campaigns, whether it be cause match, charity, whatever campaign selection you want to do. And they send out their carpet bombing emails. Of course, as everybody would only do it, you have to do it that way. Then they have their launch event, right? You have to have your launch event, right? They bring in a singer. Of course, right? You gotta make it good. You have, of course, your banquet. It's not even just a regular sushi anymore. Now you gotta get a banquet. And they launch it. They got 90 ambassadors, and sure enough, they raise the money. And there's a big event when the first truck comes to move all the snow. Everybody in the committee standing there, pictures. And make sure to put it in Mishloach magazine and Hamodia. And those are all the right places, of course, and all the internet. Okay, I'm exaggerating, right? But that's not far, but it's probably not far from what we would do, right? Probably not far from what we would do. So I'll tell you a story. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said, and Rabbi Yisrael said it over, says he remembers when he was a boy, 8 years old, in Ashishok. He lived by his uncle then. He says, an 8-year-old boy, and he says, in that place, when it snowed, it snowed. He says it wasn't possible anymore it was just too high. It wasn't possible to shovel the snow. But the boys, the children, had to go to cheder, and they were short, right? Very little. And Chalila, they would just get submerged in the snow. They're not big people. How'd they get to school? So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky remembers, he recalls this and he repeats this decades later. He said he remembers old men would come and fling themselves on the snow. And the children would walk over their backs. And that's how they would get to school. Right, so if we had to do that, would that be the first thing that comes to our mind? No. That's the second. Yaakov said that was the avas of Torah that they had. The love of Torah that they had was so visceral, so pronounced that a child has to go to yeshiva, a child has to go to school. I'll do what I have to do. And they would fling themselves. And he remembers walking over the backs of these old men in order to get to school. That's how he recalls the events. And I'll tell you another story, which I only learned this past week from Mishloach magazine. We all are familiar with the Sefer Sos HaChoshen, right? Anybody who's looked at yeshiva knows the Sefer. Dayanim, this is a Sefer used all the time, Sos HaChoshen. It's a basic Sefer on Choshen Mishpah. This Sefer has a storied history. And we're not going to get into that, but there are 2 stories that I'll share with you that speak about the love of Torah. One of them, of course, is the famous story of Rabbi Meir Bloch, that when he came to a bookseller in New York City, and he asked for a ksois, he went up and he pulled down a sefer, all dusty, and he says, this is the last ksos HaChoshen in America. It's the last one. So Rabbi Meir said there, he says, you'll see, there'll come a time when so many of these are going to be printed that'll outdo the amount that was printed and sold since the time that he wrote it until today. And that was certainly Mikuya. They've been printed by the tens of thousands, at a minimum. But there's I believe, a more poignant story, which I found to be fascinating. So we know that the Mir Yeshiva went to Shanghai during the war. When they were in Shanghai, had limited amount of Sarim were available. So famously, there was a single copy of the Sos HaChoshen in the yeshiva. And when it was brought to the yeshiva, it was missing 2 pages. This is a very well-known story that Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, the great Gaon, wrote the 2 pages from memory to fill them in. And later on, when they had another copy of the Ksos, they checked the pages against the printed version, and it was word for word. Word for word. Okay. So you say that's a great story, Rabbi, right? That's not the story I want to tell you. No. That's a great story, right? But listen, Chaim Shmulevitz, right? Okay. So but let me tell you another story about a simple person. A simple person. So who owned that Ksos? That wasn't written in the initial article written in the Mishloach Manos. In a letter to the editor, sometime later, somebody tells us who owned that particular Ksos. Who owned the Ksos? Somebody who I believe personified, typified Avas Torah. It was owned by Rabbi Shmuel Birnbaum. And this man writes that in the yeshiva they called him the Gvir. Not because he had millions of dollars, they called him the Gvir because he was the one who owned the Ksos HaChoshen. And it was ironic because he came from abject poverty. But here's the story I want to tell you. So if he wasn't a Gvir, they didn't come from a family of wealth, how did he own the Sefer? You want to know how he owned the Sefer? This is how he owned the Sefer. His mother sold her Shabbos clothes to buy the Sefer. Let's repeat that. His mother, I can imagine, probably didn't have 20 different dresses or outfits, I think I call them, right? I don't think she had 20 outfits. She probably had one. But for her son to have a Ksos HaChoshen was valuable enough to her. She sold her Shabbos clothes. Listen, I had the schus one time to see Rabbi Shmuel Birnbaum, and it's a shame because he lived right here amongst us. He lived in New York City. But he came years ago. He came and he spoke. I was learning then in an afternoon called Rabbi Achenstein Shul on Divan. And he came and he spoke. I'd never seen something like that. I'd seen it, but not like that. He walked in. He started speaking. Learning. It was in learning. There was actually a little Bobakama there. And he was overwhelmed with joy. I mean, I'm not talking like joy. I'm talking like he couldn't stop smiling. Then if you asked him a kasha, 2 things would happen. A, he would let you have it, gently. But while he's letting you have it, he's laughing. He's like laughing. And I don't remember what he spoke about. I don't recall because I was so taken by the sight. Like just the Avas Torah, the love just spilled out of him. It was just an amazing sight. Who's to say? Maybe some of that came because of the Mesiras Nefesh. She saw the Avas Torah of his mother sold her Shabbos clothes in order to buy it. So now, please don't go home and tell your wives we're selling your Shabbos. Just don't do that. I mean, it's a fascinating story. For me, though, I have to tell you, for me, the personification of Avas Torah is by Rabbi Raccah Yosef. It was otherworldly. It was otherworldly. And this I had this source of constant interaction. I can't tell you how many times he would call me to come to him, and you would stand in the room, and he didn't know you were there, and you'd stand there, and I loved it. I didn't care. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, until he lifted his head. He was in the Sefer. If you look at the picture, sometimes it looks like he's trying to crawl into the Sefer. It's just so connected to it. There's a famous story with Rabbi Yarchei. Chacham Ovadia once, it happened almost more than once, but one time, famously, in one of his older homes in Tel Aviv, on Jabotinsky, it was one of those old Arab homes. So the ceiling was really high. We're talking high. It was certainly higher than this. Yeah, a little bit higher than this. And he had ladders to get to the top. He had a huge library. He had ladders to get to the top. But he loved learning so much that if he needed to get a sefer, he didn't wait to bring the sefer down to the top shelf. He'd open up the sefer and start reading while on the ladder. And one time he forgot he was on the ladder, and he stepped off and he broke his arm. It was hospitalized. Rabbi Yosef went to visit him. Rabbi Yosef went, how much time, Rabbi? Rabbi Yoshev went with Rabbi Zilberstein, his son-in-law, Rabbi Zilberstein. They went to visit HaChaim Ovadia. And they're sitting in the hospital with him, and they sat for a long time. Anybody who knew Rabbi Yoshev, that was atypical to the extreme. And indeed, as soon as they left, Rabbi Zilberstein turns to him and he says, "Why do you stay so long?" It's like, you were kind of Mikor Cholim, you went. You don't know, whatever the Dharma of Mikor Cholim were, you fulfilled them. Why do you stay so long? So he says, this is different. This is a man who's sick because of Avas HaTorah. For that I stay longer. And indeed, that was him. Now, I'll tell you a story. When I spoke once about HaChaim Ovadia, Rabbi Yaakov Bistritz, the Rosh Yeshiva, the Montreal Yeshiva, he asked me a very, very simple but profound question. And it came out of him like with ease, but you have to think about it. So I remember the memory of HaChaim Ovadia was staggering. He knew everything. He knew everything. Everything. And he was there instantly. You were talking about any subject, and he was right there with you. I remember one time where there was a Shabbat for one of his grandchildren. And the chassan got up to speak. That takes guts, by the way. Speak in front of Chacham. He said a shtickle Torah. And while he was talking, and Chacham he never showed off. He just simply didn't show off. I mean, you can imagine it. It's really easy when you know everything to show off. He did not. So the chassan was talking, and he quoted a certain shita from Ksubas, from the shita of Betzes, and under his breath, he was just talking to himself. He wasn't talking to. He says to himself, "Yeah, Rabbeinu Peretz." And the chassan was standing right next to him, looks at him, and goes, "Yeah, it's Rabbeinu Peretz." But he wasn't trying to show off. He just knew everything. So Bistritz asked the following question. He said to me, "Reb Daniel," he said to me, "did he have a good memory, or was it Avas HaTorah?" I thought about it for a moment, and I said, it was both. I can tell you he did not have a photographic memory. That I know. Because there were times when I was with him and he had to double check something. Did not have a photographic memory. But he had a good memory. There's no doubt about that. But it's both. It's both. He had a good memory, but he loved Torah. It was to the extreme. When I was telling you before, that love of, like any love of Torah interferes with your life. It interfered with his life. He called me one time. And he said, "I need to talk to you." I went. I'm sitting there talking to him. And he was writing. When I came in, he was writing. He's talking to me. I'm sitting right next to him. I'm in inches from him. He's looking at me. And then he stops looking at me. He keeps turning. He goes to the page. He picks up the pen. He starts to write. And then he stops. Oh, somebody's here. He comes back and he looks at me, and I keep talking, and he's with me, and then he's not so much with me, and then he keeps writing. Believe me, he loved me, and he was a tremendously considerate person. He couldn't help himself. He could not help himself. He just loved it so much. It was mamish ki chayenu. Literally, that was how he lived. That was his life. If you want to see a video, it's really easy to see. Just put in on YouTube, Rav Ovadia Yosef, Rav Pinchas Scheiber. Any variation of that, you'll get a version of it. And this is one of the most amazing videos I've ever seen. Rav Ovadia, at one point, he had broken, or he had a slipped disc. Nobody diagnosed it correctly. He was in unbelievable pain. You can imagine. They told him no problem. But he's in unbelievable pain. Rav Scheinberg was leaving to America. He comes to visit him. And Rav Ovadia says to him, "Bless me. Give me a bracha." He says, "I can't learn." And Rav Ovadia starts to cry. "I can't learn." And Rav Scheinberg starts to cry. Al tivkei. Don't cry. It's amazing. And Chacham Ovadia says to him, He says, it's because of my sins. What sins? He says, I'm suffering, it must be because of my sins. But he says, I can't learn. And he's crying because he can't learn. The pain's not the problem. He can't learn, it's infecting his learning. Look, you guys are here. There's no doubt you have some Manos of Torah, no doubt. And I'm not certainly in any position to measure anything. But I want some of that. I want some of that. How do you get it? How do you get it? So yes, no doubt. Being around people that live it, no doubt that helps. Possibly the way, possibly as a source, that's how we're written about. Maybe that was part of how he got to where he was. Because what he saw what his mother did for him. What Yaakov, when he saw what the old people in Ashishok did. Maybe, I don't know. Certainly that helps. I mean, look, he took off on a work day. We have to prioritize Torah. It's first. It's not second. It's not third. It's not eighth. To prioritize it. You have some time off, a free time. What do? Do you automatically go for the Sefer? Or do you pull out your phone and scroll through the 90,000 apps you may have on who knows what? Or do you look at your Bitcoin to see where you're holding? Do we learn with Geschmack? Do we really get into the Sefer, or are we busy with other things? Maybe we need to learn more. Learning more is not necessarily more in quantity, but more in quality. To really be there. Look, you have a very limited amount of time before the Rabbi gives you a share. I forgot to tell you, there's actually an entire conference punkt on that even. You have it. If you'd like to see that, I'm sure you got all this.
I've heard about the Rebbe's library.
Sorry?
I've heard about the Rebbe's library. That's.
No, but I should have told you to talk to him. You're gonna have, you're gonna have an opportunity to so learn it. It's an interesting thing, and it has so many nafkaminas that there's some. It's like Rabbanish. I don't know what the term to use. It's like a plaything for Rabbanim to try to find out how many nafkaminas you can find. You'll see. It's fascinating. Learn with Geschmack. Learn the things you like. Connect to Torah. Connect to Rabbanim who have Avas Torah. And hopefully, Bezrat Hashem, the most important thing, you can pass it to your children. If your children see you coming to something like this and being serious about it, that says a lot. Your child will learn more from what you do than whatever you tell them. And I'll conclude with my father, Zichron Levrachah, once said something absolutely correct. He told the man, the man said, how do I teach my children? He says, forget about what you say to them. If your kid sees you come home, again, this is many, many years ago. If your kid sees you come home, understandably exhausted from a long day of work, the first thing you do is you throw off your shoes, if that's your mahalach. You go to your lazy boy chair, you sit down with a cold drink, a little bit of popcorn, and you pull out the newspaper just to relax a little bit. You taught your son. When you're tired, you read the newspaper. If you come home from work, the first thing you do is you pull out a sefer, you sit down. And you're exhausted, but your kid sees you're exhausted, you pulled out a sefer. You'll tell your kid will say, okay, when you're tired, you learn Torah. When you need to go to work, you learn Torah. When you're at work, you learn Torah. When you come home from work, you learn Torah. The best we learn. Shkoyach.